Good day. Today is the 16th of June. By my calculations, the 13th day since Ukraine began its offensive on the 4th of June. An offensive whose very existence, by the way, Ukraine continues to refuse to confirm, but which is self-evident to the entire world. Now, so far today has been little different from other days. We've had Ukrainian attacks in the Vremevka ledge area in Zaporozhye, another attack south of Orechov by troops of the 47th Brigade, which, by the way, clearly has not been relocated to Volyn, contrary to what I was led to believe and said in my program yesterday. But most of these attacks were repelled by the Russians, and with the Ukrainians apparently suffering significant losses, with tanks and other machines destroyed over the course of the fighting. There's also been significant fighting going on in other parts of the front lines, but Denis Pushilin, who is the active chief of the Donetsk regional government, the Russian-controlled Donetsk regional government, he says that, so far as he's aware, the situation is under Russian control on every part of the front lines. Now, there has been some suggestions that the Ukrainians have changed their tactics, and specifically Rybar, the Rybar Collective, which is a group of journalists whose identity is not known necessarily to everyone. They're saying that Ukraine is no longer attacking in the way that it did in the first few days. Large columns, long columns of armored vehicles trying to force their way through minefields behind mine clearance vehicles, and that way getting quickly spotted and attacked by Russian teams equipped with anti-tank guided missiles and also helicopter gunships and artillery, with all the rather dramatic pictures of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, including Leopard 2s and Bradleys, on fire, which we have seen. Anyway, apparently they reverted to a more classical style of warfare. I mean by that, a style more common in the way in which both sides conduct offensive operations. Firstly, there's an artillery barrage, then the armoured vehicles bring the infantry within sight of the front line, then the infantry dismounts and advances, the armoured vehicles chug along behind, and if the infantry manages to storm the position, then of course the armoured vehicles are there to exploit the whatever gap in the lines the infantry has achieved. Now, I haven't seen confirmation that there has been this change of tactics, but I'm fully willing to believe it. But anyway, even if there has been a change of tactics, the Russian defense all across the front line, as of this time, continues to be solid, and there have been no Ukrainian breakthroughs. In fact, we've had admissions, even from Ukrainian sources. For example, Alexei Arestovich, the Ukrainian government's former spokesperson. Anyway, he's spoken about Ukraine shedding litres of blood, the infantry shedding litres of blood. It does seem that this tactic of sending unprotected infantry towards the Russian lines all but guarantees very heavy losses. But anyway, regardless of that, whether this is a more effective tactic or not, it's not succeeding for the moment. The Russian lines have not buckled and have not broken in any way. So that does seem to be the state of the fighting at the moment. No Ukrainian breakthroughs, no sign of any advances at any point on the front line. And by the way, on that topic, the Russian-appointed governor of the Russian-controlled part of Zaporozhye region, Mr. Belitsky, has actually gone forward and said that if things continue as they're doing, if Ukraine continues to launch attacks in this fashion and suffer the kind of losses and casualties that it is doing, then he personally doubts that this offensive can go on for longer than 6 weeks. He says that after a further 6 weeks, he thinks that it will have run its course and burnt itself out. Well, that might not be entirely wrong. The Ukrainian offensives of the autumn essentially lasted 10 weeks. I get the sense that the depletion of Ukrainian armor, ammunition, and infantry fighting vehicles is on a greater scale than was the case in the autumn. I'm not convinced, by the way, that the numbers of actual infantry committed to these offensives is any greater than was the case last autumn in the offensives in Kharkov and Kherson region. But one way or the other, 8 weeks, which is what Belitsky is talking about for the totality of the Ukrainian offensive, doesn't seem far off from the 10 weeks that this offensive, that the previous offensives of the autumn were able to continue. So perhaps he's right. We'll just have to wait and see. Now, it should be said that alongside these offensives, the Russians have not been inactive, these Ukrainian offensives. There were more Russian missile and drone strikes across Ukraine yesterday. And intriguingly, Ukraine itself claimed that there was a major missile and drone offensive against Kiev. And the Ukrainians say that up to 6 Kinjal hypersonic missiles were launched by the Russians, apparently specifically against Kiev. And much of the international media is making making much of the fact that at the same time as this big Russian missile and drone attack on Kiev was allegedly taking place, an African peace delegation led by the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, and can I thank the person who has corrected my mispronunciation of his name. Anyway, an African delegation was in Kiev, and the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba has actually made comments, sarcastic comments about how the Russians, when they talk about peace, they actually practice war. They're striking at Kiev, even as an African peace delegation is in town. Now, what is intriguing about this is that the African delegates appear to have been somewhat surprised that some kind of a missile and drone attack was underway in Kiev whilst they were there. And there's this comment that's been circulating by an anonymous member of this delegation, and he's quoted as saying, "It is very strange that we did not hear or see the explosion. Clearly deliberate misinformation is being circulated here. We were perplexed when we were brought back to the hotel, and we walked through the streets where people normally continued the day." And that would suggest, and some people have taken it to mean, that this entire missile strike, drone strike on Kiev is a fabrication, a PR invention of the Ukrainian authorities. I wouldn't go that far. I think from what I've been able to piece together that the principal target of this attack was not Kiev itself, not the metropolitan area of Kiev, but the Zhuleni airfield, where the Patriot missile system and other air defense systems are or have been based, and I think it is quite possible that the Russians launched a major attack on the Zheleny base airfield. This is located some way from the center of Kiev, so it's perhaps not so surprising that the people of Kiev were not affected by it, and that explosions and sites of this air raid were not spotted when the African delegation was in town. I'm assuming, by the way, that having met Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials, these African peace delegates will move on to Moscow and see what they can achieve there. And it's highly likely that they will have a meeting with President Putin of Russia whilst they are in Moscow. I would say that Putin himself is actually, or has been, at the moment, not in Moscow at all, but in St. Petersburg, where he has been addressing the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. Now, this is a major event that the Russians put on every year, where they invite representatives and governments from all sorts of the world, all places around the world, to come and visit Russia in St. Petersburg. And it's basically a business forum. Some people have said that it's a Russian Davos. It is nothing like Davos. It's really more a kind of trade fair, as well as a place where foreign delegates can meet with members of the Russian leadership, listen to them in group chats and things of that kind, in forums that take place, and get a sense both of where Russia is going and what is happening. And Putin is in St. Petersburg, and he's just apparently delivered a major speech at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, of which, however, I do not yet have the full text, and which I will defer a full discussion until my video tomorrow. But anyway, that's what Putin is up to. Perhaps the African delegation will go and meet him in St. Petersburg rather than in Moscow. More likely he will return to Moscow and meet them there, perhaps in the Kremlin itself. We shall see. Anyway, I don't expect much to come from this African delegation, but consider how many people now are trying to broker peace in Ukraine. There's the Turkish government, President Erdogan, who brokered the peace talks, which in March 2022 almost produced a peace plan, a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine, a peace agreement that was wrecked by the British and by the United States. There's the African Union, whose, as I said, delegation is now traveling from Kiev towards Russia. There is China, whose representative Li Hui has been on his travels. He's been to Europe and Ukraine and Russia as well. And there's Brazil, whose President Lula is trying to also set up some kind of mediation operation. And last but not least, there's Indonesia as well. The Indonesian government has also come up with ideas to broker and achieve a peace. And the interesting thing about all of these moves to achieve peace is that they come to Moscow, they're well received, the Russians listen to what they say, the Russians go out of their way to make clear that they're not slamming the door in anyone's face, that they're fully open to negotiations in due course, but they point back to the fact that for the moment Ukraine doesn't seem to be interested in substantive negotiations. Their idea of negotiations is for Russia's total capitulation, and of course that is unacceptable to the Russians. And one gets the sense that the more of these mediators move around, go from speak to one party and then the other, the more gradually they come round to the Russian way of thinking And here again, I'm going to say that I think that the West is also playing its cards wrongly. Instead of sympathizing and supporting these mediation moves by all of these important countries outside the collective West, they have instead shown studied hostility to all of these moves. Sometimes one gets the impression it's because they want to see the war continue. President Blinken, for example, has regularly talked about the unwisdom of freezing the conflict. He still seems to be betting that Ukraine can win some great battle on the battlefields. But often I get the sense that the Western powers are not keen on someone else brokering a peace settlement, because doing so would mean that outside parties are involved in brokering a peace settlement in Europe, and that is not something that the Western powers are prepared to tolerate and accept. As far as they are concerned, what goes on in Europe is their business and their business alone. And they don't like outsiders, especially not the Chinese, but even all of the others coming along and telling the West, in effect, how it should manage its affairs. So I think this is perhaps a factor which has been overlooked by many people. Now, on the part of the West, one does get a sense of some uncertainty as to how to proceed. An awful lot of credibility and confidence was invested in this offensive. And there's been rumours circulating, in fact, not just rumours, there's been plans and pictures circulating that the offensive was supposed to have achieved some kind of a breakthrough by now. There's a suggestion that the breakthrough was supposed to have been achieved within 3 days, that the Ukrainian armoured forces, this big armoured fist that had been created, was expected to punch through the Russian defence lines within 3 days. And of course, if you go back a bit, there was that long article in Foreign Affairs which said that for Ukraine to succeed in this offensive, well, it needed to break through within the first 24 hours of launching the offensive. Those 24 hours would be Ukraine's longest day. And Ukraine had only a limited time scale to break through, but there was some confidence that with all this heavy armour, all this heavy equipment, the Leopard 2s, the Challenger 2s, the Bradleys, and all of that, that would suffice, that the hole would be punched through the Russian defences, and that the Ukrainians by this point would be closing in on Melitopol and the Sea of Azov and all of those other places. Well, it hasn't turned out that way. And in fact, it's important to reiterate again that we are not seeing any fighting at all anywhere close to Russia's main defense lines. At the moment, all the fighting in Zaporozhye region, in Donbass, takes place well away from those defense lines, these big fortified lines that the Russians created. The Ukrainians have not been able to break through the screening forces that the Russians have positioned ahead of those fortified lines. And if there was an expectation or a hope that punching through these fortifications would mean that they would be able to roll through this buffer zone in advance of those fortified lines, well, clearly that hasn't worked out as expected. And in fact, as we've seen, they suffered very heavy losses and so far achieved no significant progress at all. So, the West, having perhaps hoped that things would go quickly, are now faced with the fact that they are going very slowly, perhaps that they are at a standstill. And we've had comments now from people like General Austin and General Milley saying that this isn't a sprint, but a marathon. But of course, that begs the question then of who is the better marathon runner. Now, Austin and Milley said this at another meeting in Europe of this group that's there to support Ukraine, and the fact that they were talking about the marathon and all that basically shows that they've given up on hoping that there's going to be a dramatic Ukrainian advance through the Russian front lines. But of course the marathon idea depends very much on who has the biggest staying power. And here we see a Russia whose economy is growing, where living standards are increasing, where, according to Putin, arms production has increased threefold overall, and in some particular specialty areas tenfold, which has built all these enormous fortified lines, and which everybody who's followed the conflict with any care agrees is suffering far fewer losses than Ukraine, despite a much bigger population. Well, why think that in a marathon race it's Russia that will fall behind? It seems to me, and it seems to most people, I think, that over a long time it will be the Ukrainians who will suffer the attrition, the losses, who will in effect be steadily ground down. And Belitsky, the acting governor of the Russian-controlled area of Zaporozhye region that I was talking about, actually again floated the possibility that after this remaining 6 weeks period, when he expects the Ukrainians to be still on the offensive, after that period is concluded, he too seems to think that the Russians will at that point decide to go on the attack. So, Western leaders, so far, somewhat uncertain, it seems to me, what to do. Well, they might perhaps discuss with the Ukrainians revisions to the Ukrainian plans. I've discussed in previous programs how all the focus on the fighting in Zaporozhye and southern Donetsk region obscures the fact that Ukraine has been making big attacks in other places, in the Bakhmut area again, and in Avdiivka, and large Ukrainian forces have been committed to these attacks, and the attacks have been on a comparable scale to those that we have seen in the south, but they have also been repelled. They have not so far achieved anything of importance. They've failed to break through. In the Bakhmut area up to this time, they've not yet managed to capture a single important settlement. So, the other possibility is that we could revert to what was perhaps at one point an earlier plan, a Ukrainian strike across the Dnieper River, either in the area close to where the Novaya Kakhovka Dam used to be. This is an area where the Dnieper is relatively narrow, crossing the Dnieper here, taking advantage of the fact that the waters have now stabilized, and pressing into Kherson region, east of the Dnieper River, the part of Kherson region controlled by the Russians. But the problem here is that the Russians have also heavily fortified their positions. They apparently have large numbers of troops in this area of Kherson region. Putin, in his meeting with the war correspondents, the Russian war correspondents, said that the Russians would actually like an attack of that kind, because it would end in a disaster for Ukraine. Now, others have been suggesting something rather different. The way the destruction of the Novaya Kakhovka dam has played out is that most of the water from the Kakhovka reservoir has now drained through the Dnieper into the sea, and the reservoir has significantly shrunk, and it's been suggested that Ukrainian troops and armoured vehicles can now safely ford this reservoir, perhaps to seek to attack and recapture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant at Energodar. Now, I'm going to make a few observations here of my own, and this is to some extent based on actual personal experience. The Kakhovka reservoir will be a large area. Obviously, the flow of water, the quantity of water there now is very, very much reduced. But it's likely that after many years of being a reservoir, the water table will be very high, and the ground certainly will be very swampy and marshy and moist. Moreover, it's also almost certainly the case that the banks of the reservoir will be quite steep. They usually are. So, trying to move a force of infantry and armoured vehicles across soft ground and then asking them to clamber up these high banks does not seem to me to be a good idea at all. Bear in mind that whilst they're crossing the reservoir, they will have no natural cover. There are no trees, no hills, presumably, nothing of that kind that they can hide behind. They will be completely visible to Russian drones and other surveillance devices as they try to move across this swampy, bowl-like terrain. Now, as some of you know, I like to walk. This is the countryside. This is one of my great recreational pleasures. I've tried to navigate swampy streams where the water has drained. I don't think this is a good idea. I think this is actually a very, very bad idea indeed. Now, the Ukrainians might try to do this at particular hours or times when these problems might be mitigated. For example, they might try to cross the reservoir at night in the hope that the Russians wouldn't spot them. Oh, that's a forlorn hope, by the way. And in the absence of the kind of landmarks that you would expect on dry ground, it's very easy to imagine that infantry, specifically, could easily get disoriented in the dark as they're trying to advance through the mud. Anyway, that doesn't seem to me to be a good idea. And if they try to use rain cover to do it, well, of course, that would simply make the ground even more swampy and would create a whole different set of problems. Now, over and on top of all of this, there has to be the possibility that as the Ukrainians are trudging across, the Russians who would be shelling them and sending their helicopter gunships to attack them and doing all of these things, well, conceivably, they could also launch a strike, a missile strike, at the dams to the northern end of the Kakhovka reservoir, the one that is keeping the water from flowing into the reservoir. And of course, if the dam was destroyed and the water burst through, well, I don't know how long it would take for the water to reach these troops trying to cross, but I can easily see that there will be all kinds of problems created that way as well. Perhaps some of them would be swept away by the waters, and besides, those who managed to get across, they could also find themselves cut off by the flood that was raging behind them. To my mind, this is disaster written all over it. I think this is an extremely bad idea. I think it would have made much more sense for Ukraine not to tamper with the dam, if that is what it did, the Kakhovka Dam, and if they really were planning to launch an attack on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, to do this as they've been doing in the past, with fast boats trying to dash across the reservoir when it was full of water, trudging across it over swampy, soft ground with armoured vehicles, either in the daylight, when they will be openly visible, or in the dark, when they will be most likely disorientated, or through the rain, when they'll be even more waterlogged and swamped. That all looks to me like an extremely bad idea. Now, on the topic of the Russians blowing the dam, many people would say that that would be a war crime, and it might be. There is a 1977 statute that talks about it being possibly it being a war crime to destroy dams in certain circumstances, and this is true. But this isn't quite as cast iron a position as some might think, and I can see why, looking at the wording of the statute and considering the facts of this operation, it might even make sense militarily in a way that would not make it a war crime. After all, it would not make the flooding any worse. Water has already, the reservoir would presumably refill, but the water further downstream would probably not flood significantly more than it did previously. And of course, if it did interrupt a Ukrainian attack on a nuclear power station, you could argue perhaps that it was proportionate and justified. Now, I'm not recommending that the Russians do this. I'm not personally sure that any of this is going to happen. All I am saying is that, in my inexpert opinion, completely inexpert opinion, but backed by a certain amount of experience, the idea of trying to cross the reservoir to reach the nuclear power plant on foot comes across to me as an extremely bad idea. And I wonder whether people in Kiev perhaps understand it rather better than some of the commentators who have been speculating about it do. Anyway, that's all I want to say about that. It could be that I got this all completely wrong and that there is some way of fording across this reservoir and capturing the power station by some kind of coup de main. Apparently it's also heavily defended now. Lots of Russian troops in the area, lots of heavy weapons in the vicinity, Russian heavy weapons. It seems to me like, nonetheless, a very bad idea. Perhaps there's something I haven't seen, but anyway, we'll just have to wait and see. So, I don't think this is a viable plan. I think for the moment Ukraine has little real choice but to go on doing what it is doing, hammering away at Zaporozhye and southern Donbass, hammering away perhaps at the Bakhmut and Avdiivka areas, hoping that something on the Russian side will break and that they will be able to achieve some kind of a breakthrough. A breakthrough to where and to what? To the big, heavily equipped Russian front lines? I have to say, it all looks extremely problematic, but certainly for the moment, they've not achieved anything very substantial. And you're starting to see, as I said, glimmers of doubt. I mean, we've had Milley and Austin talking about this is not a sprint, but a marathon. We've had the Daily Telegraph. It's a very interesting title in the Daily Telegraph, which says that Ukrainian failures in the first few days are not Russian victories. Apparently the Russians played no role in destroying those Leopard 2 tanks or Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. It is, of course, true, and I mean, it's a banal thing to say that in any complex operation there will be setbacks. But to be honest, this whole article in the Telegraph looks like a rather desperate attempt to explain away the failure of the offensive up to now and to reassure the Daily Telegraph's audience, which has been, or readership, which has been fed on stories of one Ukrainian victory after another, that despite things looking bad, things are actually continuing to go quite well. But there have been other reports in other places, The Guardian, for example, about Ukraine encountering fierce resistance. President Zelensky himself has used that very word, fierce resistance, from the Russians. It doesn't seem for the moment as if any breakthrough is happening, and to be frank, it doesn't look particularly likely. Now, as I said, there may be some great trick that the Ukrainians have up their sleeve, which I can't guess. We shall see. But for the moment, that's where we are with this offensive. Now, I discussed earlier in the program the various steps that leaders from the global south and from China have been making in trying to get peace talks underway. What hasn't been noticed is that there's now been something of a sustained attempt by some Western leaders to re-establish communications with the Russians. So the Biden administration has proposed to the Russians a resumption of talks about limitations on strategic nuclear weapons. Now, can I say that this is something that is absolutely essential, and I hope that sometime soon it will take place, but the Russians have made it clear that for the moment they don't consider talks of that nature to be appropriate, and they've refused. And given the situation, given the sanctions, given the military situation in Ukraine, I can't say that surprises me. I mean, I don't see how the Russians are incentivized at the present time to agree negotiations of that sort. And of course, given the complete absence of trust between the Russians and particularly this administration, I have to say that I think any talks that did get underway in this current environment would be stillborn. My own view is that the administration understands that very well, and the purpose is not so much to try to agree to limits on strategic weapons. Rather, it is to try to agree to try to re-establish contacts with the Russians so as to move the topic away towards Ukraine. Now, I think that is precisely what the Russians think, and I think that is one reason why they're not interested in these negotiations at the present time. Now, another person who wants to re-establish contact with the Russians is Chancellor Scholz of Germany. He's been saying for some time now that he wants to speak to Putin on the phone, and that he's expecting to speak to Putin on the phone quite soon. And we've been hearing Scholz say this on and off for actually quite a long time now. But this telephone call between Scholz and Putin never materializes. And again, I can't help but think that the reason this is the case is because the Russians at the moment are not interested in picking up the telephone to Olaf Scholz. And again, it's not difficult to understand why. I think if the Germans thought that supplying tanks and Marder infantry fighting vehicles to Ukraine would give them leverage over Moscow, then I think they were deeply mistaken. What it has done is angered the Russians to the point where they're not interested in talking to the Germans at the present time, because they see the Germans not as a mediating power, but as an adversary. And in Putin's case, I suspect that he still nurses an entirely understandable sense of grievance over the way in which Angela Merkel behaved over the Minsk agreement, appearing to broker it, and then doing absolutely nothing to see that it was implemented, even as Ukraine rearmed, with Merkel subsequently justifying her conduct to a German audience by saying that the Minsk agreement did in fact buy time for Ukraine to rearm. I don't think people in Germany have understood how much damage those comments of Merkel's have done. Anyway, so that's Scholz. He's not yet getting his call. Putin speaks to many people every day. He's spoken to President Erdogan. He's meeting all kinds of leaders from all sorts of countries. He's had an interesting set of meetings with the leaders of the United Arab Emirates, for example, in St. Petersburg. But he doesn't apparently have the time to answer the phone when the Chancellor of Germany calls. Now, that is an astonishing set of affairs. It's something completely new. It's not something that the Germans have experienced to this extent ever since the Soviet Union broke up, but that's where we are. The Russians are not interested in listening to what the Germans have to say. And then the last person who's trying to put himself forward in some kind of mediation role is President Macron of France. And this is where Macron's attempts to wangle for himself an invitation to the BRICS summit is important. Now, many people have interpreted this as an exercise in Macron's overweening vanity, his desire to be in with every single party, his wish to be at the top table, wherever that top table is located. And I think that there is certainly some element to that. But it also seems to me that the primary reason why Macron wants to be invited to the BRICS summit, which for the moment is still planned to take place in South Africa, but where, because of the warrant from the ICC, there's now some suggestion it could be relocated to China. Anyway, we'll see. But anyway, the reason that Macron is so anxious to go to this summit meeting, that he's actually made an invitation, sought an invitation, is because he wants to meet Putin there. I mean, if you think about it, it's obvious. Putin will be, in the normal course, attending this meeting, and Macron hopes to be there, and he hopes that as part of his diplomatic exchanges with the other BRICS leaders, he'll be able to have a meeting with Putin. Except that the South African organisers and the other BRICS states, and of course the Russians, don't seem to want him and have basically closed the door. So we can see that the Western powers, some of the Western powers, are looking for a way out, or at least they're looking for some means to re-establish some degree of communication with the Russians. The Russians, for their part, are, as I said earlier in this program, very willing to listen to the leaders of the global south, to the Africans who are on their way to Russia as we speak, to the Chinese, to the Indians, of course, to President Lula of Brazil, with whom Putin, of course, had a very warm conversation shortly after the G7 summit in Hiroshima. But the Russians are not prepared to listen to the West. They're not interested in what the West has to say. And in that respect, we are at deadlock. And if the Western powers assumed that supplying weapons to Ukraine would give them leverage. For the moment, and perhaps not surprisingly, it is achieving the opposite. Having said that, it would be a mistake to think that all the pressure is on one side. The Russians may feel that the military events are turning out in their favour in this current offensive. They're probably astonished and delighted about the resilience of their economy under the sanctions siege. They're probably even more astonished and even more delighted at the diplomatic support they've received from around the world and of the willingness of many countries around the world to trade with them. But that doesn't mean that at some level some people in Russia don't feel stressed and nervous about this whole situation. And we've had a case in point in a rather astonishing article published by Professor Sergei Karaganov, a gentleman, by the way, who we have interviewed on the Duran, Glenn Deason and myself, in which Professor Karaganov talked about Russia perhaps being obliged at some point to use nuclear weapons, and nuclear weapons not in Ukraine itself, but in Europe. Now, Professor Karaganov is often referred to as an advisor of President Putin's, and as has been pointed out to me in a private email, this is something somewhat far-fetched. He is absolutely not talking here on behalf of the Russian government. He is expressing a personal view, and anybody with any understanding of the Russian power structure would know that advisor to the president in Russia is one of those honorific terms which quite a few people hold, and it doesn't in any way compare to, say, a presidential aide in the United States. So the fact that Professor Karaganov is writing a piece and he is an advisor to Putin doesn't mean that he is speaking for Putin or the Kremlin. On the contrary, the Russian Foreign Ministry, Maria Zakharova, its spokesperson, have actually gone out of their way shortly after Professor Karaganov's article appeared to say that this is not their view at all. She didn't refer to Professor Karaganov or his article, but she reiterated the long-standing Russian position that Russia uses nuclear weapons strictly in self-defense when there is an existential threat to the country, and seeks at all costs to avoid a nuclear war, which should never be fought and can never be won. That was an unequivocal rejection of the ideas in Professor Karaganov's article. But what did Professor Karaganov actually say? Well, his point is this: yes, Russia will eventually win the war in Ukraine. Yes, Russia has weathered the sanctions storm, but doing so whilst the West remains hostile doesn't, from Russia's perspective, ultimately solve the underlying problem. There will still be a hostile population in Ukraine, even if Russia occupies it all. The Western powers, while they remain committed to this open-ended support for Ukraine, could help the Ukrainians pursue some kind of insurgency against the Russians. The Russians would be trapped for decades, perhaps, in this conflict on their western border, and that's something that the Russians obviously would want to try to avoid happening. And by the way, this isn't completely wrong. This isn't just Professor Karaganov thinking in this way. My source, close to the Wagner organization, says that the Russian military have been worrying and thinking about this too. That one of the reasons why the Russians have been pursuing this incremental attritional war is that they want to break Ukraine's entire will to resist, in part in order to prevent the seeds of a future insurgency being established. And this source has said that part of the reason for the disputes between the Russian Defense Ministry and Prigozhin was that Prigozhin wanted to advance as fast as possible, wanted to achieve quick victories, was less interested in the attritional side of the war, whereas the Russian Defense Ministry, being rather more far-sighted, wanted him to take things more slowly, to pursue a more incremental approach, because their objective at the moment is not to capture territory quickly, but to break Ukraine's ability to continue resistance into the long term. Now, I should say that this source has, as he's just pointed out to me, demonstrated again his reliability. He was advising me some time ago that the Russians have been busy over the last few months training special squads of infantry to operate anti-tank weapons to take out Western tanks. And that these squads are being attached, these new highly trained squads are being attached to Russian military formations right across the front line. And sure enough, over the course, he's been telling me this for weeks, sure enough, over the course of this offensive, we have seen Russia operating exactly the way that this person said. These small squads of highly trained infantrymen, highly trained in the use of anti-tank weapons, inflicting terrible losses on Ukrainian tank forces as they try to advance. So he informed me in advance of a tactical plan that the Russians had and of a training process that they'd established. He informed me about this weeks ago, and we see with this offensive that it has turned out exactly as he said. Now, can I just say, there have been many other reasons why I accept the reliability of this source, but this is just another example. So, returning to our topic, there clearly are concerns that the Western powers might, in future, try to organize some kind of insurgency, especially in any territories that Russia eventually comes to occupy west of the Dnieper. And this same source said to me that the Russians now have information that special forces units of the Ukrainian military are now being trained on how to create improvised explosive devices to attack Russian convoys, with all the plans being made by the West to organize this long-term insurgency west of the Dnieper River. So Professor Karaganov's concerns are hardly unique to him. The Russians are aware that these Western plans exist, and the Russians have become increasingly concerned that the position of the West is implacable, and that there doesn't seem to be any way of changing it, and that though Russia might solve some of its problems in Ukraine through this war, the risk is that it will end up finding itself, once it's solved those problems, finding itself with a completely new set of problems. So what Professor Karaganov says is this: the Western powers have basically ignored every single one of Russia's red lines. They pay no attention to Russia's red lines. They escalate relentlessly. Perhaps the only way to convince them to stop doing so is to take forcible steps to remind them that Russia is a nuclear superpower and cannot be trifled with in that kind of way. And he said that the way to do that is firstly to revise Russian military doctrine in order to visibly lower the threshold beyond which nuclear weapons can be used, but also, in case of necessity, to launch nuclear strikes on targets in Europe in order to bring the West to its senses. And Professor Karaganov speculates that should such a thing happen, the United States would not want to be drawn into an all-out nuclear exchange with the Russians. And so the Russians could do that and achieve their political objectives without the whole of humanity being endangered. Well, Professor Karaganov, as I said, is somebody who we've actually interviewed on the Duran, Glenn Deason and myself. He came across to me as a very wise and amiable person. But I have to say that on this, I disagree with him completely. There's been a fine piece by Andrew Karibko, an analyst who's studied in Moscow, and he's basically taken apart Professor Karaganov's argument and has said that it is facile to think that if nuclear weapons could be used in the way that Professor Karaganov says, there could be any guarantee that their use would be limited. And I would say that I wholly endorse Andrew Karibko's point of view. In fact, this is a terrible idea. Far from causing the situation to calm down, use of nuclear weapons is far more likely to escalate. And even if I am wrong about that, the risk that it might escalate, even if it is only 1%, is still unacceptably high, given that the entire future of humanity would be at risk in the event of an all-out nuclear exchange. So I think this is a terrible idea for that reason. It's also a terrible idea in the disastrous precedent that it would set. If the Russians did what Professor Karaganov suggests, and if it achieved the results that they wanted, if it did solve Russia's problems in the West, then of course other nuclear powers would become extremely strongly tempted to use nuclear weapons to achieve whatever political objectives they had set for themselves, and we would find ourselves in a situation where nuclear weapons started to be increasingly widely used. So I think this is a terrible idea. But I am going to suggest that it is largely a product of the stance of the West. Now, it's difficult to say exactly how long Professor Karaganov has spent writing his article and to what extent he's aware of articles that have been appearing in the West. But about a week ago, we had an article in the Washington Post semi-bragging about how President Biden has been happily crossing Russia's red lines, increasing the amount of and scale and potency of the weapons he's supplying to Ukraine. He says that he won't supply one type of weapon and then invariably does. And shortly after that article appeared, talking about President Biden crossing Russian red lines, we then had a flurry of articles, including an outrageous one by Michael Rubin, suggesting that the West should consider supplying Ukraine with tactical nuclear weapons. Now, I have to say it is completely unsurprising to me that people like Professor Karaganov and other Russians aren't saying to themselves, these people do not take us seriously. We will have to do something really bad to them, something really dramatic to them before they do. And ultimately, we're being pushed to do this because instead of acting logically, these people, their first instinct is to escalate at our every move. So I think that I can even see how some people in Moscow might have said to themselves, well, we have an article in the Washington Post talking about the Biden administration, Biden himself being happy to cross Russian red lines. And then just a few days later, we have an article about the supply of tactical nuclear weapons to Ukraine. The one article is prepared to prepare the ground for the other. There are some people in the administration who are seriously contemplating supplying nuclear weapons to Ukraine. They've realized that Ukraine can't win the war on the battlefield. They're not prepared to give up, so they're prepared to go to these extreme lengths, and that leaves us with no alternative but to make absolutely clear to the West the grave implications that would have, the consequences that would have, and since they pay no attention to what we say to them, the only way we can do that is by using nuclear weapons ourselves. So I can see how this could have come about. But to reiterate again, I think this is a disastrous course that Professor Karaganov is suggesting, and I don't actually share his concerns. I don't know how this war is going to play out. I still think that President Putin expects some kind of diplomatic solution eventually. His latest comments to the war correspondents suggested that. Almost certainly the price will be higher than the one exacted by the Russians in Istanbul, substantially higher. Again, to my mind, he seemed to hint at that, though he did go out of his way to say that if Ukraine was interested in returning to Istanbul, the Russians would take notice. But anyway, I think he does still hold out for some kind of diplomatic solution to the war involving Ukraine and the Western powers. But even if that fails to happen, even if the Russians have to push west of the Dnieper, even if they have to drive all the way to the Polish border, as people like Dmitry Medvedev are saying, yes, probably some kind of an insurgency would be organized, but I personally would not give it many prospects. In fact, I'm going to suggest that the war, by that point, will have been so devastating for Ukraine, and the defeat will have been so total that the appetite to continue the war, the struggle in any form, will have been seriously diminished. Now, in every war that is fought, you hear people say that the hatred each side has towards the other is now so intense that it is impossible for them to live together in peace in future. But many, many wars of which that has been said, it has turned out otherwise. In the United States, North and South found a way to live together peacefully within the Union after the American Civil War. or the war between the states, as some Southerners apparently still call it. We saw how in Germany, after the Second World War, despite the intense resistance that the Germans put up throughout the Second World War, especially in its later stages, and despite the relentless propaganda they were subjected to, and the confident predictions on both sides that Germans would continue to resent and feel hatred towards the Allies and the Soviets, and that there would be some attempt to organize a struggle beyond that. Well, that didn't happen there either. On the contrary, the experience of the war in Germany, what it made the Germans feel, was absolutely determined not to go to war again. And the result is that for most of the post-war, Second World War period, Germany has been a very peaceful country. The same, by the way, has been true of Japan until recently. And if we go to the Caucasus, the examples of the Caucasus, the Russians fought a very bitter war against jihadi fighters in the Caucasus. And again, there was lots of claims that the Caucasian people would deeply resent and hate the Russians, and that they would remain perpetually restive against Moscow. And in fact, they haven't done so. Many of them are now fighting with the Russian army against Ukraine. Many of them, no doubt, having calculated that they were used by the West in that earlier struggle, and that it is in fact Russia which is their protector rather than their enemy. Now, I'm not making any predictions about how things will turn out in Ukraine, but I have to say straight away that I think, especially given the history, I think that a reconciliation between Russians and Ukrainians following the end of the war, with the Russians west of the Dnieper, is a much more likely outcome than these rather lurid expectations of people like Professor Karaganov. Now, that is speculative. We cannot know for certain, but even if Professor Karaganov's worst expectations come true, even if the West tries to sustain an insurgency in Ukraine, even if there is a significant mass of the Ukrainian population which remains restive and resentful of the Russians, I still expect that the Russian security forces would quickly get a grip of the situation. So I don't think the situation is as dire as Professor Karaganov says. And to repeat again, I think even if it were as dire as he thinks, it is not a good idea at all to do the sort of things that he's suggesting, quite apart from the terrible moral and human implications. I think it would create a whole set of far graver problems than the ones it was intended to solve, even if it was successful on its own terms. Having said that, last point I will make about Professor Karaganov and his article is that Westerners who continue to fool themselves that the Russians don't stick to red lines and who are a paper tiger and all that, perhaps ought to pay attention both to what Professor Karaganov has said and something else that President Putin said over the course of his meeting with the war correspondents. President Putin was specifically asked, why do we allow the Westerners, the West, always to cross our red lines? Now, I have said in the past that this is a complete myth, that the fact that the Russians sent their army into Ukraine and are conducting a war there is a sign, on the contrary, that the Russians are serious about enforcing their red lines. And that is exactly what Putin said. He said, I don't understand this point. He said, we've actually launched the special military operation precisely because the West refused to recognize our red lines. How can you say, therefore, that you can just walk over our red lines and nothing will happen? And he went on to say that there has in fact been other forms of retaliation by the Russians, and he said that some of these are known, attacks on decision-making centers in Kiev. There have been at least 2 of them, the attacks on the energy system, but he said that some of these responses are of a secret nature that he's not prepared to talk about. Well, you can take that however you will. But anyway, that's what Putin said. But the other thing is, not only did the Russians respond when their red lines are crossed, but some Russians, like Professor Karaganov, because the West is so intent on challenging their red lines, are now starting to come round to dangerous thoughts about using nuclear weapons. And given that Russia is the world's biggest nuclear power, that ought to be ringing alarm bells in the West. It ought to be making people in the West, governments in the West, reconsider their policies very hard. Once upon a time, it would have done so. There would have been shock and horror across the West if an article like the one by Sergei Karaganov had appeared. There would have been shock and horror across the West, by the way, if an article like Michael Rubin's article of giving tactical nuclear weapons to Ukraine had appeared. But instead, none of this is properly debated anymore. The pressure always in the West is to escalate, to move further up the escalation escalator. It is never to try to find an off-ramp, some way to de-escalate. And this is having consequences. And this article by Professor Karaganov is just one. Now, I think President Putin has things very much under control in Moscow. Whilst he is around, I don't expect the Russians to do anything reckless or stupid like this. But he's not going to be there forever. We can't say whether his successor will be either as wise in these matters or have the authority that President Putin does, and constantly kicking and goading the Russian bear is a irresponsible thing, because one day it might have consequences that go beyond anything that anybody in the West for the moment can imagine. Now, I hope we don't get to that point. I don't personally think we will over Ukraine, by the way, but it's something to bear in mind. And I wish I could say that there were some people in the West who were paying attention. Anyway, that's me for today. I hope that you all again join me for my next program tomorrow. Just to remind you again, we're on other platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. Links under this video. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Please also remember to check out our shop. We've got a whole set of nice new things that you can find: magic mugs and hats and hoodies and t-shirts and sweatshirts and all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. As I said, that's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.